The chandelier lights flickered as Lila Lee Harper shoved her mop across the marble floor of the Hamilton Music Academy's grand lobby, the sharp scent of pine cleaner stinging her nose. Her gray uniform clung to her like a second skin, patched at the elbows, her knuckles red from scrubbing. At 30, she was a shadow in this glittering world unseen, unheard, just the hum of her work blending with the distant buzz of gala prep. Tonight, the city's richest would flood these halls, their diamonds flashing as they toasted to art they barely understood. Lee's job? Keep their mess out of sight. She was mid-swipe when the double doors slammed open, and Margaret Maggie Voss, the Academy's iron-fisted director, stormed in, her heels clicking like gunfire. Olivia's gone. Maggie's voice cracked, raw and ragged, her phone trembling in her grip. Hit by a drunk driver on 95. She's bleeding out in an ambulance. The gala's in 45 minutes. Her blonde bob swung wild, her eyes blazing with panic as staff froze around her. Lee's mop stilled, water pooling at her feet, Rhapsody in Blue. She caught the name through Maggie's frantic rant, the night's showstopper, demanded by the Hamilton Foundation, the deep-pocketed big shots who could make or break this place. No one left in these halls could nail Gershwin's wild, soulful chaos on zero notice. No one they knew of, anyway. Vanessa Ness Carter, the Academy's Queen Bee piano coach, slinked in from the wings, her smirk cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Relax, Mags," she purred, arms crossed over her sleek black blazer. "We've got a fix. Throw an amateur up there, call it Raw Talent Night. Perfect PR spin." Her gaze landed on Lee, lingering on her scuffed sneakers and tangled ponytail. Her, the mop girl, let her crash and burn well play it for laughs and still cash the checks. Maggie whirled, her stare pinning Lee like a spotlight on a deer. "You?" she barked, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "You play piano?" The air thickened, every eye in the lobby snapping to Lee. She dropped the mop handle, it clattered loud against the stone, and straightened up, her hazel eyes locking with Maggie's. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, the tick of the lobby clock pounding like a drum roll. "I can play that piece," she said, her voice low, steady, slicing through the tension like a wire. Ness's laugh erupted, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the walls. "Oh, this I gotta see. Cinderella with a keyboard pure gold." But Ethan Morales, a lanky teaching assistant hovering near the piano, stepped forward, his voice cutting through her sneer. "She's not kidding, Maggie. I've heard her late nights when she thinks no one's around. She's unreal." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shock, doubt, curiosity. Maggie's fingers tightened around her gold necklace, her lips thinning as she sized Lee up. "You've got 40 minutes, she hissed, her smile a mask of ice. "Nail it, or you're out no second chances." Lee didn't flinch, her pulse hammering as the lights overhead buzzed faintly. They saw a punchline. She saw a stage, and those silent keys. They were about to roar a secret shed buried for years when this room wasn't ready to hear. The echo of Maggie's ultimatum micaded, or you're out hung in the air to like a guillotine blade, as Lila Lee Harper stood rooted in the Hamilton Music Academy's lobby. The chandelier light bounced off the marble, casting jagged shadows across her gray uniform, streaked with dust and damp from the mop shed dropped. Her heart thudded not from fear, but from something fiercer. Something she hadn't let herself feel in years, 40 minutes. That's all she had to turn their sneers into silence, to make those keys sing a truth they'd never see coming. Around her, the pre-gala frenzy churned on. Waiters darted with trays of crystal flutes, their polished shoes clicking past her like she was a piece of furniture. A florist wrestled with an overflowing vase of lilies, their perfume clashing with the bleach on her hands. She caught a glimpse of herself in the Steinway's glossy, curve-tangled brown hair, spilling from a loose bun. Hazel eyes shadowed with exhaustion, hands rough as old leather. No one's idea of a pianist, but those hands had danced across ivories once, back when dreams still had a pulse. "Harper!" Maggie's voice cracked through the noise like a whip, her silhouette storming toward the stage doors. "Backstage, now!" "Ethan, find her something that doesn't scream janitor. We can't put that mess in front of the Hamiltons." Her navy blazer flared as she spun, barking at a wide-eyed intern clutching a clipboard. "And fix the damn lighting, I want it perfect." Maggie's words were acid, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. The gala was her kingdom, and without that cash, it'd crumble. Lee was her Hail Mary, whether she liked it or not. Ethan Morales broke through the swarm, his lanky frame weaving past a stack of chairs. "Let's go," he said, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm. He jerked his head toward the service hall, and Lee followed, her sneakers squeaking against the floor. The polished lobby faded behind them, replaced by a narrow corridor of chipped concrete and flickering fluorescent tubes. The air turned stale dust, mildew, the faint hum of a dying bulb overhead. Her pulse quickened, not from the rush, but from the memory clawing up her throat. She hadn't played for real in a decade, not since her mom's old upright gathered cobwebs in that basement, not since life punched her dreams into the dirt. But Rhapsody in Blue? That lived in her, a wild, restless ghost she'd never shaken every syncopated riff, every soaring crescendo burned into her fingertips. They veered into a cramped storage room, a jumble of forgotten things, stacks of yellowed sheet music, a busted metronome, a cracked full-length mirror propped against the wall. Ethan dug through a rack of spare costumes, pulling out a black dress plain, knee-length, a little creased but worlds away from her uniform. "Best I've got," he said, handing it to her with a half-smile. "You holding up?" Lee studied him, his messy dark hair, his steady brown eyes that didn't flinch or judge. "I don't need to hold up," she said, peeling the L. Harper name-tagged from her chest and tossing it onto a dusty shelf. It landed with a soft clink, a small rebellion. "I need them to hear me." She stepped behind a tower of crates, the floor cold under her socks as she shed the uniform. The dress slipped on, cool and unfamiliar, hugging her frame just enough to feel like armor. She wasn't dressing up for them, she was stripping down to who she'd always been. Ethan leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "You've got more in you than they think. I've heard it those late nights, you at that practice room piano. What'd you hide it?" She stepped out, smoothing the dress, her jaw tightening. "Didn't hide it, just didn't waste it on people who don't listen." Her voice was low, edged with something raw. She'd played, after hours, for herself quiet runs of Gershwin or Chopin, the notes spilling out like a confession no one else deserved. Ethan had caught her once, months back, lingering outside the door. He'd never ratted her out. Before he could push further, Vanessa Ness Carter appeared in the hallway, blocking their path like a storm cloud in heels. Her black blazer was pristine, her auburn hair swept back, her smirk a weapon. "Well, isn't this sweet?" she said, her voice dripping honey over steel. "The janitor's got a fan club. Tell me, Ethan, when did you start rooting for charity cases?" She sauntered closer, her perfume something sharp, floral, expensive, cutting through the musty air. "You honestly think she can handle Gershwin? That piece eats talent a live shell choke, and we'll all get the show of the year." Ethan straightened, his easy calm hardening. "I've heard her, Ness. You haven't. She's got fire you can't fake." Ness's eyes narrowed, her smirk twitching like she'd been stung. "Fire? From someone who scrubs toilets?" "Please." She turned to Lee, leaning in just enough to make it personal. "Break a leg, mop girl. Or better yet, break their patience who'll be watching." She spun away, her heels echoing down the hall, but Lee caught the flicker in her stance. Ness remembered something. A competition, years back. A teenage Lee stealing the spotlight from a younger Ness. The sting still lingered, and now it fueled her venom. Ethan handed Lee a water bottle, the plastic crinkling in his grip. "She's bluffing," he said. "She's rattled. You're a threat." "Threat?" Lee unscrewed the cap, the cold water hitting her dry throat like a jolt. "Not yet, but I will be." Her mind replayed that old stage Ness's glare from the wings, the trophy Lee never got to keep because life imploded weeks later. She'd buried it deep under hospital bills and broken promises, but it was waking up now, hungry. They reached the backstage door, the muffled roar of the crowd bleeding through the heavy velvet curtain. Ethan paused, his hand on the knob. "You're ready, Lee. I've seen it those nights. You didn't just play. You owned it." She nodded, stepping into the dim wings. The Steinway sat center stage, its keys glinting under the spotlights like a dare. 40 minutes had burned down to 8. Her hands flexed, tingling with anticipation, the ghost of every note she'd ever played rising in her veins. Ness wanted a flop. Maggie wanted a savior. Lee wanted something else, a chance to make the room feel her, not as a janitor, but as the force she'd locked away too long. The curtain trembled slightly as the house lights dimmed. It was time. The backstage gloom enveloped Lila Lee Harper like a heavy, damp shroud as she edged past the thick velvet curtain, her breath catching in the stale air thick with dust and the faint tang of old wood polish. Beyond the divide, the Hamilton Music Academy's Grand Hall thrummed with restless energy, 500 voices weaving a tapestry of low murmurs, punctuated by the occasional clink of champagne flutes and the rustle of expensive fabrics. The audience sprawled beneath the massive chandelier's warm amber glow, its crystal prisms scattering light across a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and polished cufflinks. An elite crowd gathered for the gala that had spiraled into chaos when Olivia's car crash shattered the night's plans. The relentless countdown from her frantic preparation with Ethan had dwindled to nothing, leaving no cushion between her and the Steinway grand piano that dominated center stage. Its polished black surface gleamed under the spotlights, reflecting the harsh beams like a mirror of judgment, a silent adversary daring her to step into its glare. Lee's hands flexed nervously inside the black dress Ethan had tossed her in that cluttered storage room, the fabric cool and slightly scratchy against her skin, clinging to her frame with unfamiliar weight. Her scuffed sneakers, the same ones that had squeaked across the lobby's marble during her endless janitor shifts, whispered faintly as she moved forward, a stark contrast to the clicking heels of the gala's usual performers. Maggie's cold ultimatum from that first, frenzied moment still echoed in her skull. Nail it or you're out. She wasn't here to beg for their approval or scrape for their pity. She was here to burn through the years they'd ignored her, to turn their smug laughter into stunned silence with a fire they'd never seen coming. Maggie Voss emerged from the wings ahead of her, her navy blazer stiff and pristine despite the sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead, a fraying remnant of the poised director who'd barked orders when the news of Olivia's accident first broke. She tapped the microphone clipped to the podium, the sharp thunk-thunk slicing through the crowd's restless hum, like a judge's gavel demanding order. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth but brittle, teetering on the edge of control as though every syllable fought to mask the panic she'd worn when she'd thrust Lee into this gamble. "We've hit an unexpected snag tonight. Our featured pianist, Olivia Grant, was in a car accident, critical condition, according to the latest update." She paused, letting the murmur of shock ripple through the hall, her smile twitching like a bulb flickering on its last gasp, the same strain she'd carried when she'd given Lee that 40-minute deadline. "But here at Hamilton, we rise above adversity. Tonight, in the spirit of resilience and the discovery of new talent, we present one of our own staff, Lila Harper." The announcement landed like a misfired spark. Whispers erupted, a few sharp, incredulous laughs cutting through from the brain arose like arrows aimed at a target they didn't yet understand. Lee stepped into the spotlight, its white heat slamming into her chest like a physical shove, blinding her for a heartbeat as her eyes adjusted. The black dress hung loose on her slim frame, creased and rumpled from being yanked on in haste, her brown hair still a tangled bun from hours spent scrubbing floors and wiping down banisters. 500 pairs of eyes raked over her lingering on her sneakers, her calloused hands, the utter absence of the polish they expected from a gala performer. A gray-haired man in the front row, his tuxedo crisp with a gold pocket square, leaned to his wife, his voice carrying with smug certainty. "The janitor? This is their big fix? We're in for a disaster." Vanessa Ness Carter slouched against the wings, her arms crossed over her sleek black blazer, her smirk sharp and predatory, the same cruel grin she'd flashed when she'd sneered Shell Choke in that concrete corridor, her words dripping with venom as Lee had pulled on this very dress. Lee slid onto the Steinway's bench, the wood cold and unyielding beneath her thighs, sending a shiver up her spine that she quickly suppressed. The keys stretched out before her, ivory and ebony, in perfect, unforgiving rows, gleaming under the lights like a battlefield she hadn't faced since her mom's old upright fell silent years ago. Her hands hovered above them, a faint tremble running through her fingers, a whisper of doubt, a ghost of the fears she'd buried beneath the bleach-stained days of sweeping these halls and the rushed, tense moments of preparation with Ethan. She shut her eyes, Ness' taunts from that cramped hallway fading into a dull buzz, Maggie's earlier threat dissolving into the blood pounding in her ears. In the darkness behind her lids, she was 16 again. Harlem basement, rain hammering the cracked window pane, the air heavy with mildew and the faint antiseptic sting of her mom's oxygen tank. Her mom's frail hand, veins stark against pale, thinning skin, rested lightly on Lee's over their old upright piano, its keys chipped and sticky from years of use, its sound warped but alive. "Play it like it's yours, Lila," Shed rasped, the oxygen tube hissing in rhythm with her fading voice, her eye shazel like Lee's, glinting with a pride that outshone the pain etching her face. That was the last time Lee had played for anyone. The last time she'd felt seen, before cancer stole her mom weeks later. Before the hospital bills and eviction notices forced her into this invisible life. Until Olivia's crash and Nessa's venom dragged her here, to this moment. Her fingers struck the keys with a fury that split the air like lightning. Rhapsody in Blue erupted into the hall, not a tentative fumble or a shaky note, but a bold, brassy clarinet wail that punched through the chatter and snapped every head upright, as if the room itself had been jolted awake. The jazzy intro swung hard, her hands tearing into the syncopated rhythms with a precision that felt like instinct, a fire that had simmered through every unnoticed night she'd spent in this place, playing in empty practice rooms when the halls fell silent. The crowd's whispers choked off mid-breath, replaced by a stunned silence that thickened the air like a fee rolling in off the river. Nessa's smirk twitched, her arms uncrossing as she shifted her weight, unease creeping into her stance. The taunt she'd thrown in that concrete hallway unraveling before her eyes as Lee's hands danced across the keys. Maggie gripped the podium's edge, her knuckles bleaching white beneath her manicured nails. The gamble Shed made when she'd forced Lee into the spotlight teetering on the edge of collapse or triumph, she couldn't yet tell. Ethan Morales, stationed near the curtain, gave a single sharp nod. His quiet insistence that she's unreal, now a truth blazing through the hall, a spark of vindication in his dark eyes. The piece roared into its first crescendo, the chords thundering against the hall's vaulted ceiling, shaking the chandeliers until their crystals rattled faintly, a delicate chime underscoring the raw power pouring from the piano. Lee's body leaned into it, her shoulders loose, her breath sinking with the pulse of the music, sweat beading on her brow and trickling down her temples. Then the sabotage struck mid-phrase. The spotlight above her buzzed loudly, a harsh electrical crackle splitting the air, before plunging half the stage into shadow. Gasps erupted from the audience, a ripple of panic spreading like wildfire through the rows. Nessa's hand twitched near the wings. Shed slipped a 20 to the lighting tech in that rush corridor moment. A petty jab to ensure Lee's fall, a trap Shed set with the certainty that Lee would crumble under the pressure. The crowd braced for a stumble, a crash the janitor label they'd pinned on her ready to stick like tar. Lee didn't flinch. She played on, blind in the dark, her fingers locked to the keys by muscle memory alone, each note ringing out with a clarity that defied the chaos. The darkness turned the music into something primal, sharper, louder, a defiance that drowned the mockery Shed endured when she'd first walked these halls, the doubt Ness had flung at her as she'd pulled on this dress. The crowd's gasps shifted to held breaths, 500 souls leaning forward in their seats, caught in the raw, living power spilling from her hands. Halfway through, the memory crashed in harder her mom, skeletal under a faded quilt in that Harlem basement. The hospital beeped steady in the background, whispering, "You're enough, Lila," as Lee played the same piece on that warped upright, her mom's last smile flickering before the end. The lights sputtered back, dim and unsteady, casting a faint glow across her face, and Lee pushed harder, the jazz riffs darting with a fierce, almost playful grin, the crescendos slamming like a storm breaking open over the city. Sweat streaked down her cheeks, her face alight, grief, rage, and release woven into every strike, her body rocking with the rhythm, as though the music itself was pulling her free from the years she'd been buried. A woman in the fifth row pressed a silk sleeve to her eyes, tears smudging her mascara, her shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. A critic near the aisle, his notepad forgotten on his lap, stared slack-jawed, his pen dangling uselessly between his fingers, his breath caught in his throat. Lee's hands flew through the final measures, the tempo accelerating, her fingers a blur of motion as the piece built to its climax, every note a howl of everything she'd carried. The bleach-stained nights, the taunts in that concrete hall, her mom's fading voice urging her on. The last chord crashed at a bold, defiant blast that reverberated off the marble columns and hung heavy in the air, a sound so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Silence gripped the hall for 3 long beats, the tension coiling tighter, the audience frozen as if afraid to break it. Then its shattered applause detonated, a tidal wave of sound, feet stomping, chairs scraping as the crowd leaped to their feet. "Bravo!" tore through the hall, raw and unscripted, echoing off the high ceiling and bouncing back in waves. Lee stood, her chest heaving, sweat glistening on her brow, her breath ragged but steady. She offered a tight, sharp nod, not a bow, not yet, their hazel eyes sweeping the room. Catching the shift from shock to awe, a tide shed turned with her own hands, her own fire. Then the twist landed like a thunderbolt splitting the night. Daniel Dan Hamilton rose from the center aisle tall, silver-haired, his tailored suit cutting a stark line through the chaos, clapping slow and deliberate, each strike a hammer blow that silenced the cheers. The noise faltered as he climbed the stage steps, his steel-gray eyes locked on Lee, piercing through the haze of sweat and adrenaline. "Hold it," he said, his voice booming across the hall, a cannon shot that hushed the crowd to a murmur. "Lila Harper, where the hell have you been hiding?" Whispers flared, a wave of confusion rippling outward like cracks in glass. Maggie's jaw dropped, her grip on the podium slipping, the dread shed carried since forcing Lee into this moment peeking into something raw and exposed. Ness stiffened, her sabotage now a petty footnote, her arms falling limp as the weight of his words sank in the venom she'd spat in that corridor, dissolving into irrelevance. Lee's pulse spiked, his face snapped into focus. A ghost from the buried past she'd locked away, a memory stirring from the edges of her mind. Dan turned to the crowd, his presence commanding every eye, every breath. Harlem Youth Center, 2008. She was 16, played Rhapsody in Blue like she owned the damn world, played it better than half the pros have funded since. I offered her a scholarship, a recording deal, everything. Then she vanished. He faced her, his tone softening but firm, a question wrapped in recognition. "What happened, kid?" Lee swallowed hard, the weight of those bleach-stained years crashing back, hospital corridors thick with antiseptic, her mom's frail form sinking into a bed she'd never leave, the choice that broke her path before it could begin. "She was dying," she said, her voice low but steady, cutting through the mic like a quiet blade across the silence. "My mom." I stayed. Dan nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his stern face, softening the lines etched by years of command. 14 years I've hunted that kind of soul something real. Not this polished, hollow crap. He glared at Maggie, then Ness, his voice rising like a conductor cueing a final shattering note. "I found it tonight, not in your overpriced gala, not in your manicured Lees and her. You nearly let her sweep your floors instead of shake them to their foundations. My foundation's done funding your bullshit unless she's part of it." The hall detonated again, cheers, gasps, a chaotic swell swallowing Maggie's choked whimper, her empire teetering on the brink of ruin. Ness backed into the wings, her reign crumbling into dust, the taunts shed flung now a fading echo. Ethan's grin widened his quiet faith from that rush prep moment, now a blazing truth. Lee stood, her sneakers firm on the hardwood, the room hers in a way those early, unseen days could never have imagined. Shed played to break free not for their applause, not for their redemption, but for the truth Shed carried through every silent night, a fire they couldn't douse, a legacy that would carry into the fight she'd take up next. The Hamilton Music Academy's Grand Hall shuddered under the weight of Daniel Dan Hamilton's final words. "My foundation's done funding your bullshit unless she's part of it." The applause for Lila Lee Harper exploded into a wild, chaotic roar, a tidal wave of sound slamming against the marble columns and setting the chandelier's crystal prisms trembling, their faint tinkling swallowed by the raw energy surging through the space. Lee stood firm on the center stage, the Steinway's last Rhapsody in Blue, chords still buzzing through her fingertips from that blinding performance, her black dress drenched with sweat and clinging to her frame like a war-torn flag waving in the aftermath. The spotlight flickered, one last, Feeble sputter from Ness's failed attempt to plunge her into darkness, casting sharp, jagged shadows across her face, her hazel eyes steady and unyielding beneath a brow glistening with exertion. She wasn't their janitor anymore, not the silent figure who'd scrubbed their floors unnoticed, nor the desperate pawn Maggie had shoved into the spotlight when Olivia's crash flipped the night upside down. She was Lee Harper, and the name she had carved out with that fiery defiance now hung heavy in the air, a truth shed carried through years of being unseen, unshaken by their refusal to look her way until she'd forced them to listen. Maggie Voss lurched out from behind the podium, her navy blazer crumpled and sagging at the shoulders. Her blonde bob a tangled mess, spilling into her eyes. The once commanding director who'd barked that 40-minute ultimatum, now a woman grasping at the fraying threads of her control. The microphone clipped to her lapel buzzed faintly, catching her uneven, shallow breaths as she forced her voice to climb above the uproar. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hamilton Dan," she began, her tone pitching high and frantic, a far cry from the cool authority she'd wielded when the gala's chaos first erupted. "This is nothing short of phenomenal, a living testament to our mission here at Hamilton. We've always sought to nurture hidden talent. It's exactly why we gave Lila this extraordinary platform tonight." Her hands flailed, smoothing her jacket with trembling fingers, clutching at nothing as if she could pull the narrative back into her grip, the same desperate scramble she'd shown when she'd thrust Lee into this mess, betting on a failure she could spin into sympathy. The crowd shifted uneasily, some nodded absently, caught by her polished desperation. Others leaned forward, their eyes narrowing at the cracks splintering her story, the lie laid bare in the silence that followed her words. She flicked a glance at Lee, her blue eyes wide and glistening with a silent, pleading command. "Help me sell this. Save me just this once." Lee stepped closer to the mic stand Maggie had left behind in her faltering retreat, her sneakers thudding softly on the hardwood, a sound that sliced through the murmurs like a knife through taut fabric, a quiet echo of the resolve she'd found when she'd tossed aside her janitor's rag in that hurried backstage scramble. "You didn't give me a platform," she said, her voice low, steady, and sharp as tempered steel, each word landing with the weight of those bleach-stained nights she'd spent unseen, the sneers she'd faced when Ness had doubted her every move. "You threw me up here to crash and burn, hoping I'd be your punchline so you could play the savior. I took it, I made it mine." The front rows gasped, a hush rippling outward like a stone dropped in still water, the air thickening with the shock of her unvarnished truth. Maggie's face flushed crimson, then drained to a ghostly white, her pearl necklace trembling against her collarbone as her throat bobbed with a choked, inarticulate sound, a gasp or a swallowed before it could break free. Lee wasn't here to prop up their sinking ship or gloss over their failures. She'd played for the 16-year-old buried beneath those endless shifts, for her mom's frail whisper. From that blackout moment when the lights failed, not for this gilded cage that had mocked her when she'd first slipped into that black dress, nor for the hall that had nearly crushed her under its weight of disbelief until she'd turned it to ash. Vanessa Ness Carter shrank deeper into the wings, her once cutting smirk erased, her arms dangling limp like a puppet abandoned mid-show, the venom shed spat in that cramped hallway, and the sabotage shed rigged with that $20 bribe now a noose tightening around her neck. The spotlight trick her petty scheme to drown Lee in darkness hadn't broken her. It turned Lee into a phoenix rising through the blackout, a force that left Ness' carefully built empire in ruins. Ethan Morales stood near the curtain, clapping slow and deliberate, a quiet "I told you so," curving his lips, the faith he'd voiced when he'd handed her that dress now a beacon in the storm. Then the blow struck with devastating clarity. A girl with tight braids, Ness's star pupil, a 15-year-old prodigy, honed for national competitions, broke from the crowd mid-applause, her steps resolute as she marched to the stage's edge, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. "Miss Harper," she called, her voice clear and piercing, rising above the fading cheers. "Can you teach me instead?" She turned, jabbing a finger at Ness, her dark eyes blazing with a defiance that echoed Lee's own when she'd played blind under that failed spotlight. "She never let me play like that, like it's alive, like it's mine." All she cared about was winning, not feeling. The crowd hushed, 500 heads swiveling in unison, the air crackling with the weight of her accusation. Ness flinched as if struck, her face crumpling, her auburn hair falling into her eyes, her lips parting in a silent, shattered gasp. "You don't know what you're throwing away, Kiana," she hissed, her voice cracking like brittle ice under a boot. But the girl didn't waver, her gaze locked on Lee with a hunger Ness could never satisfy. Ness's hands shook as she stumbled backward, her heels clattering in a frantic, uneven retreat down the backstage corridor, a sound that faded into the shadows, swallowed by the rising tide of whispers. "She's the real deal," a boy in a red hoodie muttered to his friend, another of Ness's students, his voice carrying as others nodded, the swell of defection growing louder, a chorus that drowned her legacy in its wake. Ness's reign shattered before the entire hall, her name reduced to a bitter footnote, her pride trampled by the very hands she had tried to mold into her image. Dan Hamilton stepped forward, his silver hair catching the flickering light, his tailored suit a quiet testament to the authority he'd wielded when he'd climbed that stage, and asked her where she'd been. 14 years, he said, his voice a deep rumble that rolled through the hall, commanding every ear, every breath. "I've poured millions into programs, scouted kids from coast to coast, built Stage Assault to find that soul I heard in Harlem, 2008. She owned that piano at 16, played Rhapsody like it was her blood, and I offered her everything." He turned to Lee, his steel gray eyes softening but firm, a recognition that reached back to the moment he'd pinned her with that question under the spotlight's glare. "Tonight, I got it back, not in your overpriced galore, not in your hollow promises in her." He pivoted to Maggie, his glare a blade forged by years of disillusionment. "You nearly let her sweep your floors instead of shake them to their foundations. My foundation's done unless she's part of it." The hall erupted. Cheers swallowed Maggie's choke. "Done?" The empire she'd clung to since that first frantic moment, teetering on the edge of collapse. She gripped the podium, her nails digging into the wood until her knuckles blanched, her forced laugh high and brittle, like glass splintering under strain. "Dan, please, let's sit down. Lila's a talent we can—" "Too late," Lee cut in, stepping forward, her sneakers scuffing the stage with a quiet, unshakable resolve, the same strength she'd found when she tossed aside her name tag in that rushed backstage scramble. "I'm not your crutch, your mascot, your redemption arc." She met Dan's gaze. The why, she'd asked when he'd climbed those steps, answered in the weight of his nod. "My program, Keys to Rise," he said, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the chaos like a lighthouse beam, piercing fog. "Music for kids like you, we're gifted, overlooked, fighting to breathe. I want you to run it, teach them, play for them, show them they're enough. Full salary, your stage, and no more mops, no more shadows." Lee's breath caught in her throat, her fists clenching at her sides as the offer sank in like rain, soaking parched earth, the memory of her mom's. "You're enough," from that blackout moment, flashing vivid and sharp. Kids from Harlem's cracked sidewalks, hands hesitant but hungry, eyes like hers at 16 when the world hadn't yet crushed her dreams. Not a handout, not a fairy tale of fight she'd already won, a purpose she'd forged in the silence of those unseen years and the fire of that blinding performance when she'd played through the dark. "Amen," she said, her voice ringing through the mic, firm and unshakable, cutting through the hall like a clarion call that silenced the last murmurs. "Not for you, not for this place, for them. The kids who think they don't count, who think they're nothing because no one's ever told them they're worth hearing." The applause detonated, fierce and unscripted, rolling through the hall like a storm breaking free, the sound swelling until it shook the very walls and rattled the windows. Dan clapped her shoulder, his grip firm and steady, nod sealing the pact, the respect he'd shown when he'd asked her what happened. Now a bond forged in shared vision. Maggie retreated backstage, her heels clicking a defeated rhythm down the corridor, her kingdom fraying at the seams. The authority she'd wielded when she'd first forced Lee into this spotlight, now a ghost fading into irrelevance. Ness was gone, her students defecting, their voices rising in a chorus of "She's the real deal" that echoed through the wings, the tide that had begun when she played blind. Now a flood washing her away entirely, leaving her legacy in tatters on the floor she'd once ruled. Weeks later, Lee strode through the academy's halls one last time, not with the mop shed hauled through those bleach-stained nights, nor the rag shed clutched when Ethan handed her that dress, but a worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder, dog-eared sheet music spilling from the top like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Shed traded the black dress for faded jeans and a scuffed leather jacket, the fabric creaking faintly as she moved, her sneakers still bearing the scars of those endless floors, but carrying her with a new lightness, a sureness that hadn't been there when she first walked these corridors unseen. The lobby gleamed as ever, its marble cold and pristine under the soft glow of the chandeliers. But it felt smaller now, less daunting, a space she'd outgrown with every note she'd played under that flickering spotlight. She passed Maggie near the reception desk, the director's blazer swapped for a plain gray sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight, tired bun, her polish dulled by the strain of scrambling to salvage what remained after that night's fallout. Lee nodded a curt, neutral gesture, devoid of malice or triumph, just an acknowledgement of the space they'd shared. Maggie returned it with a tight twitch of her lips, respect perhaps, or just the exhaustion of a fight she'd lost long before she had realized the battle was over. The power had shifted, and the air between them hummed with that unspoken truth, a quiet reckoning of a struggle neither had foreseen ending this way. Downtown, in a cinder block rehearsal room, with peeling paint in a single grimy window, letting in the late afternoon haze, Lee sat at a chipped upright piano, its keys yellowed and uneven but warm under her touch, resonating with a faint, honest hum that filled the small space with life. 8 teens sprawled across mismatched chair skids from the kind of streets she'd grown up on, where music was a whisper drowned by sirens and hope a gamble against stacked odds. Their hoodies hung loose, their sneakers scuffed and patched like hers, their faces a mix of guarded curiosity and restless energy, the same invisible spark she had carried when she'd scrubbed those floors, the same hunger she'd felt when she'd first sat at her mom's upright all those years ago. She knew that look. She'd worn it, carried it through the sneers of that concrete corridor and the fire of that blackout moment when the world had tried to bury her under its doubt. My mom used to say music's not about what they think of you, she told them, her fingers brushing the keys, coaxing out a faint, resonant hum that seemed to pulse through the room like a heartbeat. It's about who you are when they're not looking, when the world's blind and you still play, because it's yours, because it's you. She launched into Rhapsody in Blues, opening well, short, fierce, the notes bouncing off the bare walls like a call to arms, a spark igniting in the dim, gritty room. The kids straightened, a boy with a faded cap tapping his foot, his eyes narrowing with a focus that hadn't been there moments before, his hands twitching like he could feel the rhythm in his bones. A girl with chipped purple nail polish leaned forward, her breath catching as the sound hit her, her hands flexing as if reaching for something she couldn't yet name. Lee paused, sliding over on the bench, and nodded to her. "Try it," she said, her voice soft but sure, carrying the same quiet strength she'd found when she'd played through that failed spotlight. The girl hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys, then pressed down shaky at first, off rhythm, a stumble of notes that faltered and broke like a voice cracking mid-sentence. She flinched, pulling back, her shoulders hunching, but Lee's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steadying her with a warmth she'd learned from her mom's frail touch. "Keep going," she said, and the girl tried again, the sound steadying into a faint echo of Lee's fire, a fragile, living thing taking shape, rough but real. Her lips curved into a grin, a crack of light breaking through years of shadow, a spark Lee recognized from the girl she'd been when she'd first played for her mom's fading smile. A boy with a buzz cut, quiet until now, shuffled up from the back, his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets, his eyes darting nervously between Lee and the piano. "Can I?" he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room, rough with a shyness that masked something deeper. Lee nodded, scooting over further, and he sat, his shoulders hunched, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. He hit a clumsy chord, harsh, discordant, a sound that made him wince and glance up at her, braced for judgment, but then another, and another, each one softer, surer, until a rough melody emerged, raw and unpolished but alive with a tentative courage. He looked up at Lee, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and something brighter hope, maybe, or the first flicker of belief in himself. "That's it," she said, her voice steady. and he grinned a small, crooked thing that lit his face like a match struck in the dark. A flame she'd kindled with her own. A third kid, a wiry girl with a scar across her knuckles, pushed forward from her chair, her voice bold and brash. Me next. She sat without waiting, her fingers slamming 3 notes, halting. Jagged run that sounded like a shout, but they were hers, unapologetic and fierce. Lee nodded, her chest tightening not with pity, but with pride, a pride that swelled as she watched them claim what she'd fought for. This wasn't the gala spotlight or the Academy's hollow applause. This was her truth, reclaimed, a spark she'd carried through those silent nights of scrubbing, through the fire of that blackout performance when she'd defied their doubt. Now igniting in them, one trembling note at a time, a chain of light she'd forged from her own. She stepped outside as dusk settled over the city, the rehearsal room's hum fading behind her, replaced by the distant wail of a siren cutting through the evening air and the low rumble of a subway vibrating beneath her feet. The skyline sprawled under a bruised purple sky, Harlem's jagged edges softened by the haze, the lights of downtown flickering like stars against the gathering dark, a constellation of lives she'd once been part of, unseen and unheard. She leaned against the rough brick wall, the leather jacket creaking faintly as she shifted her weight, her breath fogging in the cool air as she tilted her head back to take it all in. This is my stage now, she thought, the echo of that final chord hers at last, not for Maggie's gilded crowd who'd laughed at her sneakers, not for Nessa's scorn or Dan's applause that had pulled her from the shadows, but for those kids, for the girl she'd been when she'd played for her mom's fading smile, for the woman who'd seen her when no one else had dared to look. Ness had faded the sabotage she'd orchestrated, a tale that emptied her classes. Her name a whisper of failure in music circles, her students defecting to Lee's fire like moths drawn to a flame they'd never known they needed. Maggie clawed to save the Academy, the gala that had once crowned her now a cautionary tale etched into her fraying legacy, her polish peeling away with every donor who walked away. Dan's keys to rise took root. Lee its beating heart, her name a quiet legend, not for the win, not for the spotlight, but for the fight she'd waged and won, a fight she now passed on like a torch held high. Here with these kids, she understood. The real victory wasn't the cheers that had shaken the hall or the offer that had lifted her from obscurity. It was proving she'd always been enough, mop or no mop, and lighting that truth in others until it burned too bright to extinguish, a fire that would outlast them all. Lee's story cuts through the noise with a truth that hits like a fist. The world can chain you, label you janitor, nobody, nothing, but it doesn't own your soul, your fire, your worth. She was invisible, a shadow they mocked, until she grabbed those keys and roared, because she knew she was enough when they were blind to her, deaf to her, certain she'd fade into the cracks they'd carved for her. The lessons raw, unyielding, and real. You don't need their stage, their applause to stand tall, you already do, right now in the quiet where they can't reach. Lee didn't just play music. She played her fight, her heart, her unbreakable core, and it tore their world apart, rebuilt it in her image, a testament to what happens when you refuse to stay silent. How many of us are silent keys locked away by someone else's rules, someone else's doubt? Break them, shatter them. Your fire's not theirs to dim, it's yours to unleash, yours to wield, yours to pass on until it lights the dark for everyone who's ever been told they're not enough. You are claim it and let it burn. If Lee's battle sparks something in you, smash that like button. It's how we keep these stories blazing bright. Drop a comment below. Ever been counted out like her? Shoved into a box you didn't fit? Seen someone smash the mold and rise from the ashes? Tag a friend who needs this. They might be the next to ignite, the next to roar. Subscribe, we're inches from 1,000. And next week's a boxer no one bet on, fighting his way up from nothing. You in? Hit that button, join the fire, let's keep the keys ringing, let's keep the fight alive.